So doing a little simple form study checkpoint today. That was what I assigned early on this week for anyone interested in some, some assessment on their forms. Wonderful place to, wonderful way to discover your own issues and just be aware of them when you're taking on subject after you strip object from subject. Let's start off with some simple announcements. Thank you everyone for coming. Announcement number 1 is please make sure the subscription bell is on my channel for you. So a lot of people have said that for some reason theirs wasn't turned on. They turned it off on their own, or somehow it got turned off, or they're not sure how and why that's turned off, but it might be due to that awkward growth period that YouTube was going through recently. The studio update, the crackdown on all the bots that they've been doing, bot subscriptions, as well as Google Plus shutting down. It might have just caused a big mess in the way things function. So please make sure that my channel is on for you so that you can get notifications. It's really crazy that I can't access all my subscribers. It's absolutely bonkers to me. I'm not sure why do they even have subscriptions. Yeah, please make sure that's turned on. If you haven't joined the Reddit, please join the Reddit. This is where I'll be hosting all of our challenges, where I take work for any kind of homework challenge. Like today, I picked all the stuff here from this wall. If you don't know how to submit stuff, please go to the Reddit and join there. If you don't know how to get there, go to istabrack.com. It's the little Reddit icon here at the top right. There is a portrait studio sale this June. Please be aware of it. It'll be 50% off. So if you can wait a month and a half for it, it might be towards the end of May. It might be the last week of May, first week of June. Just depends on when I'm taking my June birthday vacation, which is just going to be a week off, just so I can have a week to myself to do stuff. Or I'm not even sure what the hell is happening then, but I just want to make sure that sale is up and at it before classes are on break. It's just a tiny little summer break. I am booking students for summer tutoring. Spring is kind of backed up at the moment, but for anyone interested in private tutoring, I am booking students for the summer starting now. And any last little updates, if you want to join on Patreon, you can help keep the community going. You can fund it. I've never taken any I forget what the word is, but sponsorships, there we go, or agencies or anything like that. So I've pinned that here at the top of the community. If you want to support, if you want to give back, even just joining as a dollar watcher, it's just one way to give back to the community. If I've ever given you a critique, if you've ever benefited from this community in any way, if you've been a long member of it and want to give back a little bit, you can join as a $1 patron. You can also choose this the pledge of your like you can choose that how much you want to pledge, and then anything higher you get lots of rewards for that. So you get educational material if you join as an apprentice. You become part of our apprentice group. You get a private stream, private content from me, my own personal work, as well as my brushes and everything that I do. Is given to you, and I of course critique your work in the streams, the monthly streams for homework. Villain design challenge is due on the 30th, so make sure you guys are on that already. You should be done. You should be well into figuring out your final painting layout for the villain design. If you don't know what that is, it's pinned at the top of the community. Read through it. I talk about all my favorite villains and their common stem between them all, a common template that unifies all their designs so that you can design a believable villain for your portfolio. It's just a fun little thing for us to kind of simulate a studio type environment with a director over you, but you get to write your own villain this time around instead of it being pre-written for you. I might host another challenge for the summer where I write out the exact story you're supposed to be designing. So just like we did with the ancient weapon design challenge, I write the narrative and you have to design for it. I'm a little bit tired today. I'm sorry I'm out of it. Let's move in. So today's theme was about organic forms and fabric. So let's start off just by talking about them. Organic forms and fabric folds have something very similar in common, which is that they have no harsh edges. They're organic in that they just exhibit more curves, less geometric symmetry. So they have no right angles. Everything is randomized. Everything is based off like a situational collapse or wind effect or something like that. Studying organic forms will lead you into being able to render organic subjects. So hair clumps, hair curls, different kinds of fabric, body, anatomy, arms, thighs, legs, breasts, stomach. You'll be able to break down these forms and be able to render them, especially when you're assisted by a reference. So the common thread between them all is that their contour lines are all curved. So let's just say we have a curved surface here. All right, so I'm just squishing these together. So these longitude and latitude lines, what they reveal to us is a change in perspective. They reveal to us which areas are the most exposed to the light, which are the largest, least obstructed squares. So these are the least exposed to the light if the light was top down or coming from this kind of angle. So studying your longitude and latitude lines, these grid lines, this mesh, is really great for figuring out the surface area. The reason why it's important is because you need to know what you're doing with your brush strokes, what you're doing with your shadows. So this is very, very important when you have a combination of bone and flesh, and that is obviously on the human body. We have areas of the forearm that get really, really bony the closer you get to the wrist, and then get really, really fatty the further you go. And that would be the wrist here. And that would be the wrist getting all squared. So this tapered edge ends up becoming a wider gradient. And it's really nowhere to really study that or be prepared for that kind of change unless you're doing it in a form study type of setting. You can do photo references, of course, but remember that you're masking on top of it the layer of subject. And subject is always going to trick you into thinking like symbols again. And seeing symbols again where you started off when you used to outline more than render. So I just want to remind you that in every student I've ever booked or in every study regimen, I have always assigned organic form studies. They are wonderful for helping a student perfect their radial shading especially. And remember that radial shading is two-parter. It's both in the slow climbing hills and that sand pile effect, and in the slow descent into the cavities and that kind of like hole effect here, that drilling effect that happens. And you want to make sure that your brush is always light, always low feed when it comes to opacity, but high feed when it comes to color. So these are the tools you need to equip yourself with when entering the world of organic form studies. And the reason why I categorize organic form studies with folds is because they just work really, really similarly. It's almost the exact same type. I would categorize them as the exact same type of structure. You have the curves, you have edges caused by the object on itself, and then you've got just tons and tons of cylinders or tons of spheres distorted. When I wanted you guys to do fabric studies, I guess I should have been more specific with it, but because I assigned them at the same time, I was expecting no references to be done for fabric studies. And I didn't say really fabric studies was more folds. So folds should have been done without any reference. The reason why you want to challenge yourself this way is because you're trying to force your brain to work as a cylinder. When you have a photo, you're always having something answer the question for you. You're always having something decide these values, and all you're tasked with doing is just seeing these differences or seeing these changes. When you construct your own, let's just sketch out a really simple fabric study here, just something basic. Okay, what you're trying to figure out is how to pull this and make it render just out of, with no references, just out of the randomized folds that you've created here. The reason why this is important, the reason why you have to work like this for a while without reference, is so you can teach your brain to bridge that gap between object and subject. Right now, you may be great at cylinders, but when it comes down to using one on a subject, you completely blank out. And it's that awkward puberty stage that happens between marrying your values that are, cylinders and all the stuff that you've done to perfect this, and then moving into your subject and remembering your forms and transferring them back in. You shouldn't always need a reference. This is why working without reference is the goal. You shouldn't always need a reference to pull off basic forms, and these are basic forms. But basic never meant simplicity. Basic never meant simplicity. Basic never meant that things are going to be a walk in the park. Basics just means fundamentals, and fundamentals are tricky business. So I'm going to start critiquing some of these, and hopefully we can find like that common mistake that you're dealing with and help you get over it. It's always good to find that common problem, because that's what's going to reveal to you your next subject of study. And I cannot do this without a basic brush. So, still have not loaded that in yet. Alright, let's preset manager. Then restore default. Okay. And then general brushes. Let me see what this is doing. Okay, so I'm just gonna really quickly just use pen pressure, a very simple little setup here for a basic brush, because it's the best kind of brush for me to work with at the moment. Alright, so did it just load in general brushes? Yeah. Alright, so opacity is all the way down. So is flow. Actually, let me turn up flow for a sec. Okay. Number one thing that you need to start thinking about with your radial shading is the direction of the light source. Because that will let you know exactly when that core shadow that reflects the light started, and it's the highest point of the mountain. I would say that if we were to rotate this and would make it perfectly parallel as a line with the light source is here, we've made a perfect line to this, we can see that where you've placed the shadow at the moment is just a little bit high. Okay, so I would say the cast shadow needs to be, the core shadow mid-tone needs to be a little bit lower. So I would move it down here. Lighten. Alright, and that's because you've got so many different drops and little cuts here. Every single new drop is a new value. So you need more midtones here than shadow. The core shadow is when you really start getting that rejection point, and I'd say that starts right about here. Cast shadows should stretch a little bit longer. They're more distortions of the original shape. They're not the exact size of the shape that's casting them. And if the cast shadow started here, there's no reason for the core shadow to be running so low. The core shadow should cut halfway, sort of. And there should be a mid-tone. Okay, so that mid-tone, I'm just going to use darken layer. That mid-tone would sit somewhere here. Because it's not a top-down light, so that means that we can't have a top-down shadow and then cast a shadow that way. You don't have a top-down shadow on this bump. Why should there be one here? Okay, so I'm going to ignore the cast shadow that you have here, and I'm going to focus only on creating the same kind of shadow you have on this side. So that's a problem. You have the same bump on one side, but you didn't cast the shadow the proper way. I'm going to throw in a little terminator right there, looking at my navigator, and then throwing that shadow back up to its origin, which is the root. Of the shadow, which is the base. Right, and then again, that distorted length, and then a thicker finish for the cast shadow, because cast shadows get fuzzier the further they get. Alright, as for the highlighted areas, I'm just going to radially grow. And I'll just give you a quick demonstration on radial shading. So we've got brush stroke number 1, number 2, number 3, until it slowly, gradually gets higher. Same thing with the other side. And it's the same thing here, but this time I'm not going to. You still need a midtone here, so you're missing midtones. You're kind of just being a little too harsh with your cutout. You know, your cutting point for these forms, for these core shadows. So this is another way for you to provide a midtone, which is using smudge brush. And this is my own smudge brush, the number 4. It's my favorite one, and I use it on 8%. Alright, so that's one way to introduce midtones organically, so just blend the way you would. And the same problem here, your cast shadow is almost as sharp as the edge you have here. Unless that light source is super sharp, that does not happen. And if the light source was super sharp, then a lot of other things would be happening. There'd be it'd be short shadows, definitely, because it would be a high light source if we're talking universal. And then there would be the drowning effect, that overexposure that happens with direct light, like a floodlight. But all cast shadows are somewhat, bless you, all cast shadows are somewhat fuzzy, even at the start, even the root, because they don't, light has a texture to it, believe it or not. And light's texture is based off the fuzziness and the distance between each photon ray. I mean, that makes no sense. I mean, I'm not really sure if I know the sciences and terminology perfectly, but it's that little distance between each ray that isn't perfect, and it expands like it expands outward. It's an explosion of light moving outward in many directions. It's sharpest when you get closer to the object casting it. That's when it gets hottest, because light is heat, and dimmer and weaker and cooler the further you get from the object. So no matter how close to this light source this object is, it's still not close enough to have really, really hot, sharp cast shadows. Do you understand? And then there's that bounce light that's required, and that's just me radially climbing that. And if you're not sure how to climb it, you just brush stroke number 1, number 2, reaching the high point, which is going to get the most bounce light. And that created a little dot. That's okay. You can leave things kind of dark here in the middle. You can completely throw the bounce light right here. Okay, and if you want to have more pronounced bounce light, feel free to just go for it. Just make sure that your bounce light value is nothing compared to your highlighter value. And what's left after a bounce light takes over a region. Remember, the bounce light is something I did towards the end. Terminator line is left. So the source of this bounce light is this surface. And you have to start, when you have many shapes in one scene, you have to start allowing them to communicate, because that's why we're putting many shapes in one scene, sharing a light source, so that one day you can draw a guy on a horse running through a forest, and there's a big moon, and then there's a bonfire, and there's a bunch of floaty little spirits, and then all this light communicates with each other, bouncing off of each other, creating different changes to the light environment. So start practicing that in your form studies. Just because you are stripping subject doesn't mean you're not anticipating the fact that you will fill a room up with objects that respond to the light source. Okay. And then there would be a bit of a diffusion here, because this is just too dark, considering that a bit close to the light source. And any area that receives light, so this is a surface that's receiving a cast shadow and is receiving light. Just because it has a cast shadow on it doesn't mean that light isn't going to get bounced through. So the bounce light in here, that's not bounce light, that's mostly the light still coming through after the light kind of just snuck in. It still is on a surface area that's catching light. And I would say this cast shadow, I'm going to zoom out all the way, this cast shadow travels for a while. Okay, and then I'm just going to blur that. And we're going to take a look at your before and after and see what you're missing. And I got that soft brush and took the time to build it because that's what's required. I'm going to use this hard edge brush to kind of sharpen the starting point ever so slightly. But you can't sharpen a starting point of a cast shadow without the respective climb and value right beside it causing that. And it can't be more than the highlighter. So I'm blocking it in really. And then I'm going to blend it back. So smudging is blending. When I say blending, I just mean smudging. We do get those circular hugging shadows, those core shadows that hug every form. Because it's either top down casting shadows this way, and I think this cast shadow will be a bit more that way. Top down casting shadows this way at an angle, and if it is, that means that this would really kind of hug the form a little bit more. Just like that. But there's so many mistakes that we can keep here and no one would be the wiser, because that's just, there's a lot of light that we can not do well and we still get away with it. There's a lot of the light that we don't have to capture exactly. And then there's the bloom. Sometimes I like pulling off the bloom with a dodge tool if I'm working in grayscale, but I don't like getting you too used to dodge tool because working with color means for every time I dodge I have to go back and desaturate, and that's just too much work. So doing it manually is like the best thing. I think the light source doesn't, because these can collapse and that they kind of meet at a point right here, but you're typically just painting that little bridge that they have in between them. So this whole section should actually look like that, because it's not, the light source doesn't meet right away, if that's really what's happening. But you see, we got away with doing this, with not doing this. We got away with it big time, because we don't have to do it exactly. It's just as long as we pointed to the presence of a shadow in this general vicinity, you get away with it. But typically, if the light source was as you described it, with this large object and what it was saying about the position of the light source and where the light source was coming from, I would, and if the cast shadow was where it was, I would put a little piece here, especially from what you were doing with this cast. So this one here, the light being top down, was okay with the cast shadow coming off the tail, but it wasn't okay in that it was attached to the same object, with light source that was coming from the top right, facing the object. So one was top down, one was top right. That's not acceptable. You have to keep the light sources consistent. But you get away with a lot. You get away with a lot. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be exact like mine, or mine is not exact either, or as exact as mine. Just as long as you get the general picture. Dooge and tool is for the fool. My mods, ladies and gentlemen. Same thing over here. The cast shadow should be a little bit longer. There's no reason for light to travel that far out. And then you have that missing midtone again, which is a problem. Sometimes you do have sharp, midtones, but be careful with your value, your sharp dark value. It's just too dark for what you're saying with the midtones. And then I would oops, I'm just eyeballing it, seeing what I can pull off. Probably should use a smaller brush. Okay, and then right, I'm just gonna smudge the rest. So no one did any reference-free fabric studies, so I can't work on those. Good job on keeping the edge here because it coincided with a bottom edge, but here it rounds off because this is what you're saying on the outside. What you say on the outside contour is a reflection of what's happening on the interior values. Good job with that. I think what you're doing with your cast shadow here is a little bit off. It should be higher. Because unless that little area is collapsed, the cast shadow works like a contour line sometimes to reveal the surface angle, the elevation on the surface. So remember that. Okay, and here you use this, okay, so you use the same sharpness for the cast shadow as you did for the contour. This is a problem because what you're saying on this other side here is that this is all, there's no sharp edge here. There is no sharp corner, so there should be no sharp introduction of that core shadow. Should all be gradual. Using a really, really light step. And the cast shadow can be sharper. Cast shadow, just because it comes from a circular blended surface doesn't mean that it gets blended just because of that. Cast shadows are to do with the light. And it's just generally too dark. You're jumping way too fast with, or way too much, I guess, with your core shadow to cast shadow color, as well as like what you're doing with your cast shadows, period. They're just too dark. Something like that is a lot better, and then lighter the closer you get to the edge of the cast shadow. This is okay, but it's again the surface area you're casting the shadow on is being revealed, so I think that is more circular. So we can't talk about organic form studies without talking about radial shading. So I'm going to try to find one with some kind of good lesson on that. Yeah, this whole thing is off. Just zoom out to correct it. It's looking okay. Okay, I guess okay. It's looking okay. Sean. Sorry. Trying to get through this lesson. So if it molds suddenly, like if it pulls suddenly out, then okay, then we can blend it. But then if it suddenly grows out, that means there's a crease. And so if there's a crease, that means that we are not seeing where that ball met that surface. So and And that means that there's going to be a line, a variant, like, value in between the two. And I'm trying to figure out what that value is going to be. Is it going to be a bounce light on one side or the crease on the other, or a bit of both? We'll clean up after. So, I believe, select inverse, it's going to be a bounce light on the side most likely to be exposed, which is going to be the surface here. And the shadow will be on the darkest part of the crease. But just so, you know, they don't undo the work, we'll make sure that one side still has a bit more of the presence of the cavity there. And then just select inverse and blend. And I'm just cleaning up. And then instead of that, because this is all pretty close up, I'm going to use the blur tool for the edge of the core shadow. The core shadow is giving me trouble because I don't think it's going to be there. I don't think that's where it goes. But I'm going to leave it. No, I'm not. I think it would go somewhere there. Just make sure you remember that. Okay. Moving on. Let's look at this fabric study here, and then we'll look at some radial shading. So I'm just gonna crop this. God damn it, where's the classic crop? There. So what you're doing here is that the light is coming from, so let's track down, and I don't really care what core shadows the student uses. I care about, the cast shadows, I care about the core shadows. So you're saying that this sharp cast shadow here was only sharp if it hits the ground. It's not sharp if it hits the object. Why? It should hit the object. And if it's coming from this surface, and this surface is casting on like that nearest, so we're getting a vanishing point, thinking about the light source as the vanishing point, so we're just doing that. Just based off what you're just eyeballing it, the light source is probably somewhere over here. That means that this is the nearest surface that gets that cast shadow, and then we'll lead that back down there. And that seems more like a accurate guesstimation. I hate that word, but it works. Of the cast shadows trail. Alright. So okay. So that means that this is all cast shadow. And then what you do everywhere else is going to be the core shadow. And that's the cylinder. That's the cylinder. So getting that soft brush. Oops. What the blob? Oh, stupid ass. Stupid. Okay. It's only on soft brush. So that's okay. All right. Okay. So then I'm going to, the thing is, if this cast shadow was fell on a surface that was bumpy, that cast shadow would also take its values. And then we've got, before I blend that, we've got this core shadow right here for this cylinder. And that is completely in the light, even though the light is coming from the top left. that's unacceptable. So I think right now fabrics are a little bit too advanced for you. See how I'm breaking it down into simple shapes? And so what I'm assuming is that instead of this being perfectly straight, this has more of a mountain shape to it, like on the other side. So that means we're going to have a curve towards the very top. And that would be the curving top. Not towards the bottom, because this is all pretty straight from this point, I guess, to this point. But from this point to this point, there's a very significant drop. So that's what we need to include. Oops. So again, and then thinking about the other area as well. So lasso. It's not a typical fabric study because I've already done fabric studies with you guys. It's more about learning to see the cube in the fabric study. Yeah? Because there's a cube is in everything, even in a cylinder. And this would be that core shadow that you were missing. And the light source just is not rotated enough based off what you did with this cast shadow here. The light source isn't looking at this. This object has looked away from the direction of the light source, but you've given each ring, each bend of the fabric or each bend of the mountain its own light source. That's not how this works. It's the highest point that rejects the light. That's where it starts. And that's what you've got to remember. Okay, so the highest point here is all core shadow. Okay. Alright, and then that's when we can leave this one alone. But this one here, you just got to finish off what you were doing in this direction, and that's just making sure everything is in the same position. Alright, and then you blend. So smudge tool. And then of course, this is just me really simplifying what you did. If there are bumps and pinches at the top, if it's not perfectly cylindrical, of course you have to edit that and do it in your own way, but this is the surface geometry of what you did wrong. Like the edits what you did wrong to reveal what you were missing. Okay, and then we've got the core shadow, which I blend more because it's more of a cylindrical surface. And then this would probably need one of those curved tops here as well. And then the cast shadow, which I would use a small brush on. This is why we block and then blend. Right, and then same thing down here. And then slowly but surely all these core shadows and cast shadows will start to look accurate to each other. And I'm not going to let the floor cast shadows be any sharper, except for their root, than what they look like on the shape itself. You guys think that because a cast shadow is on the shape, it behaves differently than if it was on the ground, and that's because you have a symbolic memory of what cast shadows do, and that is inaccurate. I'm limiting the general haze of shadow on this half of the mountain. Right, because that's where it should have stopped. As for the shape, the type of fabric you're going for, it doesn't, I mean, I don't even know if it's fabric really. Maybe it's just a bumpy hill. But you need to show a little bit more of a natural pattern. If you're going to go for rocks, try to capture the rock. If you're going to go for fabric, try to capture the nature, the external contour dance, I guess, of the fabric. And that would mean, you know, if it was a rock, it would be more, let me use freehand, it would be more, you know, like that. If it was fabric, it would collapse with a lot more downward force and reveal more of the gravity around it. So something more like that towards the top, as if someone pinched a handkerchief or something like that. But that should be an improvement. Right now your core shadows and your cast shadows are not speaking to each other. And that's what should happen in an organic form study, in any study, because cast shadows and core shadows are reflections of each other. This, you teleported this edge over here and cast that shadow. Does anybody have any questions at all? Any questions at all about any of these changes? So look at before. See how you had just one blotch of light? That doesn't make any sense at all. After, you have more presence of the core shadow per cylinder. So just, if you have a question, just at Istabrack and they'll be able to answer it. It was more of a bumpy blob hill. Same thing, you still have a cylinder that you can track down. If this was a fabric study, I would just say show more fabric styled patterns and bumps and then the root of the fabric. But that doesn't save you. It being a bumpy hill doesn't save you. You still had core shadows missing that every bumpy hill needs. Yep. They need to speak to each other. The half that is the darkest is where the cast shadow is going to point to. That's the direction it's going to point in. Okay, so I'm feeling like my voice is just a little bit going away. I'm going to talk about this one real quick. Here you're climbing into your highlights way too soon. Way too fast. Your highlights are stronger than your background value. I mean, I've never seen an environment where the object is super bright and a universal light source and the background is darker. That doesn't work like that. If the environment is bright and these are suspended shapes, I'm assuming there's open space behind, and as every form study should be, then the forms should be darker than the object because the objects are the only thing holding pigment. And then select inverse. They're the only things that are dark. The background is nothing but light traveling in a very far away surface that's receiving them. And then select inverse again, and then in the same way you have a super bright light on the object, but you also have super dark values. Which is it? Is it a light scene or a dark scene? Because core shadows can be dark, but they're not so dark they've darkened the object, only in that area. This is a pretty light mid-tone you're working with. So you need to cut that down, cut that contrast down, because in all the areas where you had white drowning everything, you now have 0 information. From this point to this point, there's just one value. Excessive contrast is excessive black and white, and in black and white there is no info. So I use dodge tool, darken brush mode to get rid of that, and you just really just have these two values here. They're hardly speaking to each other, and what you need to do is reflect that surface contour that belongs to that is organic objects and create more midtones. Midtones is information. This is what I mean. This is the perfect example of what I mean when I say midtones are information. So if you've never understood what I mean by that, it's right here. I'm making more grays than black and white because I'm revealing more surface area, more of the object. The object is in the black and white. And then black and white are really, really small areas at the end of the day. Where before we did all this blending, you had this just no information there. Unless it was an edge, and unless it was a cube, you have to blend that out, because that's what you're saying on the outside of the organic object. The organic object indicates it's how you should blend it based off its outline. If its outline is circular, then you use wide gradients. But there's no such thing as gradients, because everything, it's either radial or not, or flat. Radial means that for every sliver of new elevation or new drop is a new value, and that's why we work radially. So we, essentially what radial shading is, it's in the application of the paint. You have brushstroke number 1, brushstroke number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. As you're shrinking your brush, using the shortcut for shrinking brushes. Alright, that's radial shade. See how we climbed it gradually up? I'm going to raise the opacity just a little bit for time. And I'm going to climb the shadows in another direction now. And that's radial shade. My brush is shrinking as I'm applying the paint to create the illusion of space, of volume. Right. Our values are spiraling, we're revealing surface. Same thing for elevations. Brushstroke number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Our paint is increasing because we started off with white and we're getting an elevation. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you everyone for coming. Make sure you're doing these form studies. Make sure you are completing this regimen, this part of your journey. Without form studies, you're not spending the right amount of efficient mileage per unit that you're going for. If you don't spend this, then you're waiting on the next opportunity to get some semblance of an organic form in the future masterpiece you're trying. Stop masterpieces, because masterpieces are so high variety in subject matter, apart from the fact that you don't have the skill yet for a masterpiece. But they're so high variety in subject matter, you never really focus on one kind of matter. And you're never really spending the right amount of time blending that area out. Figuring out that contour, figuring out that radial technique, knowing exactly when to shrink your brush, understanding that you need that finesse, that familiarity with your brush strokes. It's mileage in brush strokes as well as mileage in subject matter. It's, you're figuring out how to use your hand, how to use these brushes, and getting familiar with shrinking your brush with the open and closed bracket or whatever other key you've assigned. Thank you everyone for coming to this focused workshop. I will see you guys on Tuesday. Next Tuesday there won't be any homework for it, but I am still gonna try to focus on studies. So I'm gonna see who's doing photo reference studies based off this week's response to this week's classes. So this week we did a photo reference piece and capturing likeness, and this week we did organic form studies. So if I see people responding to this week's critique hours with their own versions or recreations, and I will critique those. Other than that, I'll probably just critique whatever's posted. To join the class, go to istabrack.com and click on the little Reddit icon. Please make sure you join the Reddit. If you want to support on Patreon and help us reach 1,000 patrons, please do. Even if it's just for $1 as a watcher, it still helps support the longevity of this class and keeps it going and frees my time. I've found that it's become very difficult to do anything with my advancing medical situation. So any amount sent towards my direction helps keep things moving in a healthy way, and not puts the pressure on me to book so many classes or do so much and save most of my energy for a critique hour. Especially with my voice, because these are recorded and put up, where with private critiques, they keep the recording, but all of my recordings go public along with my bad voice. But today's been pretty good. It's been getting really strong. After my break, my voice disappeared like that, but it's been getting much stronger. I hope it sticks like that. And the Villain Challenge. Make sure you're reading through it. See if you're interested in joining. Might be too late by next week if you're joining, but it might be too late because it's due on the 30th. But good luck everyone with all your homework. I will see you guys on Tuesday, the 16th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Bye, guys.